I watched 12 strangers look at me, their faces shifting from doubt to disbelief. For weeks, I sat there accused, and when it finally did, the room changed. The evidence they had trusted turned on its maker. That's the moment they realized I wasn't the criminal. The real one was sitting on the other side of the courtroom.
I watched 12 strangers look at me, their faces shifting from doubt to disbelief. For weeks I sat there accused, silent, waiting for the truth to surface, and when it finally did, the room changed. The evidence they'd trusted turned on its maker. That's the moment they realized I wasn't the criminal. The real one was sitting on the other side of the courtroom. My name is Daniel Morrison, and this is the story of how I nearly lost everything to someone I trusted more than anyone in the world. It started on a Tuesday morning in spring. I remember because the magnolias were blooming outside my office window at Morrison & Associates, the accounting firm I'd built from nothing over 15 years. The scent drifted through the open window as I reviewed the quarterly reports, numbers dancing across my screen in neat columns that told the story of our success. My business partner, Marcus Webb, knocked on my doorframe. Got a minute? Marcus had been my friend since college. We'd started this firm together, two kids with big dreams and bigger ambitions. He was the charismatic one, the face of the company who charmed clients while I worked the numbers. Perfect balance, everyone said. Always, I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. He sat down, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. Professional, distant, not the Marcus who'd been best man at my wedding, who'd held my daughter Sophie when she was born, who'd sat beside me at my father's funeral. We need to talk about some irregularities I've found in the accounts, he said. The word irregularities hung in the air like smoke. In our business, that word carried weight. It meant investigations, audits, criminal charges. What kind of irregularities? I asked, my voice steady despite the sudden racing of my heart. He slid a folder across my desk. Inside were printouts of transactions I'd never seen before. Wire transfers to offshore accounts. Falsified client statements, embezzlement that totaled nearly $2 million, and every transaction bore my digital signature, my authorization codes, my credentials. Marcus, I didn't do any of this, I said, my hands trembling as I flipped through page after page of fabricated evidence. I know this is hard to hear, Daniel. I've been your friend for 20 years, but I can't ignore this. I have a legal obligation. Legal obligation? I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Marcus, someone is setting me up. This isn't real. His face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Something I couldn't quite read. I've already contacted the authorities. They'll want to speak with you. That's when I knew. In that fraction of a second when his mask almost slipped, I understood that my best friend, my brother in everything but blood, had betrayed me in the most calculated way possible. The police arrived within an hour. Detective Sarah Chen was professional but firm as she read me my rights in my own office, in front of employees who'd worked for me for years. I saw their faces through my office window. Confusion, shock, whispers spreading like wildfire through the bullpen. They arrested me at my desk, metal handcuffs cold against my wrists. The walk through the office felt endless, every eye on me, every whisper cutting deeper than any blade. My wife, Jennifer, was waiting at the police station with our lawyer, Robert Klein. Her face was pale, eyes red from crying. Sophie, our 10-year-old daughter, stood beside her, not understanding why her father was being treated like a criminal. Daddy? Sophie's small voice broke through everything. It's going to be okay, sweetheart, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But it wasn't going to be okay. Not for a long time. The arraignment was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, or so it seemed. Bail was set at $500,000, which we barely managed to scrape together by mortgaging our house. The judge's gavel fell like a death sentence, and I walked out of that courtroom a free man in body only. My reputation, my business, my entire life was now hanging by a thread. And Marcus? He stood in the gallery, watching, waiting. The local news picked up the story within 24 hours. Local accountant accused of embezzling millions. The headline screamed from every screen, every newspaper stand. My face, the one I'd used in company advertisements and charity events, now represented greed and betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our quiet neighborhood in the suburbs transformed overnight. News vans parked outside our colonial-style home, reporters camping on the lawn like vultures waiting for scraps. Jennifer closed all the curtains, but we could still feel them out there, watching, judging. Sophie stopped going to school. The other children had seen the news, heard their parents talking. Kids can be cruel, but adults who should know better taught them that cruelty. She came home in tears the first day, saying her best friend's mother wouldn't let them play together anymore. I held my daughter as she cried into my shoulder, and something hardened inside me. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. This was about protecting my family from a monster I'd once called friend. Robert Klein, our attorney, was a sharp man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He sat across from Jennifer and me in our dining room, files spread across the table like evidence of a life falling apart. "The prosecution's case is strong," he said bluntly. "They have digital records, authorization codes, transaction histories, all pointing to you, Daniel." "Because they're forged," I insisted. "Marcus has access to everything. He's been my partner for 15 years. He knows every system, every password." "Proving that is another matter entirely," Robert interrupted. "Right now, it's your word against a mountain of digital evidence. We need to find proof that someone else had the technical capability and opportunity to frame you." That's when Jennifer spoke up. She'd been quiet throughout the meeting, processing everything in her methodical way. My wife was a software engineer before Sophie was born, brilliant with systems and security. "The metadata," she said suddenly. "Every digital file has metadata, timestamps, location data, device information. If Marcus created those transactions, the metadata might show inconsistencies." Robert leaned forward. "Can you access those records?" "Not legally," she admitted. "The company's servers are now evidence. But if we could get a forensic computer analyst to examine them properly." That night, after Robert left, I stood in Sophie's doorway watching her sleep. Her favorite stuffed rabbit was clutched in her small hands, her face peaceful in a way mine hadn't been in days. She looked so much like her mother, the same dark curls, the same determined chin. The quiet streets of our neighborhood, once so peaceful, now felt like a prison. I wondered if anyone watching the news could imagine their own hometown turning against them so quickly. What would you do if your whole community believed you were guilty? Drop your city name below if you're following this story. Sometimes just knowing others are listening makes the darkness a little less heavy. I made a decision then. I wouldn't let Marcus destroy us. I would fight, not just for my freedom, but for the truth. The next morning, I started my own investigation. If the police wouldn't look beyond the surface, I would. I began with the basics, tracking Marcus's movements, his meetings, his sudden changes in behavior over the past year that I dismissed as stress. Jennifer helped, using her technical knowledge to guide me through the labyrinth of digital forensics. We couldn't access the company servers, but we could examine my own computer, my emails, my personal records. And slowly, we started to find cracks in Marcus's perfect frame job. There were timestamps that didn't align with my known whereabouts. Security camera footage from the office building that showed Marcus accessing my office late at night when I was provably at home. Small things, inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but together began to form a pattern. But we needed more. We needed something concrete, something undeniable. We needed a smoking gun, and I knew exactly where to find it. Marcus had always been meticulous about his appearance, his reputation, his image. But every perfect facade has cracks if you know where to look. I remembered a conversation from 6 months earlier, before my world imploded. We'd been having drinks after work, and Marcus mentioned investing in cryptocurrency. The future of finance, he'd called it, eyes bright with an enthusiasm that seemed out of character. At the time, I'd dismissed it as Marcus being Marcus, always chasing the next big thing. But now, in the harsh light of betrayal, that conversation took on new meaning. Cryptocurrency, untraceable transactions, offshore accounts. I shared this with Robert during our next meeting at his downtown office. The building was old but dignified, with walls lined with law books and framed diplomas that spoke of decades of experience. If Marcus was siphoning money, he needed somewhere to hide it, I explained, pacing the length of Robert's office. Traditional banks leave trails, but cryptocurrency, especially if routed through the right channels, could effectively make millions disappear. Robert finished. He tapped his pen against his legal pad, thinking. But proving Marcus has hidden cryptocurrency accounts won't be easy. We'd need access to his personal devices, his private records. Then we get them. Robert's expression hardened. Legally, Daniel, we do everything by the book. If we obtain evidence illegally, it's worthless in court. Worse, it could damage your case. He was right, of course. But the law moved slowly, and my trial date was approaching fast. 3 months. 12 weeks until 12 strangers would decide if I spent the next decade in prison. Jennifer had another idea. Marcus's ex-wife, she said that evening as we sat in our darkened living room, curtains still drawn against the outside world. Diane. They divorced 2 years ago. It was messy. I remembered. Diane Webb had been part of our social circle, a warm woman who taught elementary school and organized neighborhood book clubs. The divorce had been sudden and bitter, whispers of affairs and financial disputes that Marcus never discussed. You think she knows something? I asked. I think a woman doesn't walk away from a 20-year marriage without reasons, and I think those reasons might be relevant to us now. Finding Diane wasn't difficult. She'd moved to an apartment complex on the other side of town, a modest place far removed from the luxury home she'd shared with Marcus. When I called, she initially refused to see me. I saw the news, Daniel, she said, her voice cautious over the phone. I don't want to get involved in whatever you and Marcus have going on. Please, I said, and I didn't hide the desperation in my voice. Just one conversation. I think you know something about Marcus that could help me prove my innocence. There was a long silence. Then, tomorrow, 2 o'clock. There's a coffee shop on Elm Street, the Daily Grind. I'll give you 30 minutes. The next day, I sat in a corner booth of the Daily Grind, a small cafe with exposed brick walls and the smell of fresh coffee that reminded me of simpler times. Diane arrived exactly on time, looking older than I remembered. Stress had carved lines around her eyes, turned her blonde hair gray at the temples. We ordered coffee neither of us really wanted, and then she spoke. Marcus is a liar, she said bluntly. I didn't know how much of a liar until it was too late. He hid accounts from me, moved money around, created this elaborate financial structure that I only discovered during the divorce proceedings. My heart raced. What kind of accounts? Offshore, cryptocurrency wallets, shell corporations registered in states with minimal transparency requirements. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through saved documents. My divorce attorney uncovered some of it, but Marcus settled quickly to keep it quiet. Paid me enough to go away and stop digging. She showed me screenshots, bank statements, transfer records. Evidence of a man who'd been planning his deception for years, long before he'd turned that deception on me. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Diane's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a familiar pain. Because Marcus destroyed my life, and I had to suffer in silence. But you're fighting back, and maybe, just maybe, you can bring him down. She slid a flash drive across the table. Everything I have is on here. Make it count, Daniel. Robert Klein's office transformed into a war room over the next week. The flash drive Diane provided contained years of Marcus's hidden financial dealings, a roadmap of deception that painted a very different picture than the one the prosecution had built. Jennifer worked alongside Robert's forensic accountant, a sharp woman named Patricia Hayes, who specialized in financial fraud cases. Patricia had the kind of mind that could look at numbers and see stories, patterns that revealed intent and planning. This is sophisticated, Patricia said, her eyes glued to her laptop screen as she traced money flows through a maze of accounts. Webb's been moving money in small increments over years, avoiding the thresholds that would trigger automatic reporting. He used your company's legitimate international transactions as cover, piggybacking his theft onto real business. But can you prove it? I asked, standing behind her chair, watching columns of data scroll past. I can prove the pattern exists. I can show that these accounts are linked to Webb. What I need is definitive proof that he had exclusive access to create the transactions attributed to you. That's where we hit our first major roadblock. The company's server logs, the records that would show who accessed what and when, were in police custody as evidence. Robert filed a motion for our forensic team to examine them, but the prosecution fought back hard. They're protecting their case, Robert explained after a particularly contentious court hearing. If we get access to those servers and find evidence that exonerates you, their entire prosecution falls apart. They've built their case on the assumption that you're guilty. Anything that contradicts that narrative is a threat. The assistant district attorney was a woman named Victoria Palmer, a rising star in the prosecutor's office known for her aggressive tactics and impressive conviction rate. She'd made it clear in pre-trial hearings that she considered my case a slam dunk. Your client had means, motive, and opportunity, she'd said during one hearing, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd never doubted her own narrative. The evidence is overwhelming. This is a waste of the court's time. But Judge Martin Hayes, no relation to our forensic accountant, was a careful man who believed in due process. He granted our motion for limited forensic access to the servers, though under strict supervision and with prosecution observers present. The examination was scheduled for a Wednesday, 2 months before trial. Patricia and Jennifer would work together, with Robert and a police detective watching every move. We had 8 hours to find what we needed. I couldn't be there. Conflict of interest, Robert said. So I spent that Wednesday at home with Sophie, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in our disrupted lives. We baked cookies, worked on her math homework, played board games. But my mind was miles away, in a climate-controlled server room where my future hung in the balance. Jennifer called at 6 p.m. I knew from her voice before she spoke a word. "We found it," she said, and I heard the exhaustion and triumph mixed together. "Daniel, we found the proof." The metadata on the fraudulent transactions showed something the prosecution had either missed or ignored. The files had been created and modified from a device with a unique identifier, a laptop registered to Marcus Webb. More specifically, transactions supposedly made during times when I was provably elsewhere, when security cameras showed me in meetings or at home. But that wasn't all. Patricia had discovered something even more damning. A hidden partition on the company server, accessible only with administrator credentials that Marcus alone possessed. Inside that partition were drafts, practice runs of the embezzlement scheme, created months before the actual thefts began. And in one of those draft files, buried in the metadata comment section, where most people never thought to look, was a note. Just a few words typed and then forgotten, probably never meant to be saved. Frame Daniel, offshore by June. Cayman accounts ready. Marcus had documented his own crime, his own betrayal, in a place he thought no one would ever look. Robert immediately filed new motions with the court, attaching Patricia's report and Jennifer's forensic analysis. The evidence was technical, complex, requiring expert testimony to explain, but it was solid. For the first time in 3 months, I allowed myself to hope, but Marcus wasn't finished. Not yet. The backlash came swiftly and viciously. 2 days after we filed our new evidence, Marcus held a press conference. He stood on the steps of Morrison and Associates, the company we'd built together, surrounded by employees, clients, and reporters. The man I'd known for 20 years had been replaced by a stranger wearing a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of wounded betrayal. "I stand before you today heartbroken," Marcus said, his voice carrying just the right mix of sadness and determination. "Daniel Morrison was my friend, my brother. I trusted him with everything. And now, facing the consequences of his actions, he seeks to destroy my reputation with baseless accusations." I watched from home, Jennifer gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. "The evidence against Daniel is overwhelming," Marcus continued. "These new allegations are nothing more than desperate attempts by a guilty man to shift blame. I have cooperated fully with authorities from the beginning. I reported the fraud when I discovered it, though it broke my heart to do so, and I will not be intimidated by false accusations. He was good, so convincingly good that I saw comments on the news website already turning against me again. Of course, the guilty party would try to blame his partner. This is what criminals do when they're caught. Poor Marcus, betrayed twice by the same man. The court of public opinion was brutal and swift in its judgment. Our neighbors, who'd begun tentatively waving again, returned to their suspicious glances and locked doors. Sophie's school called, suggesting that perhaps she needed a bit more time at home. Jennifer's mother stopped returning her calls, but something unexpected happened in the darkness. A text message appeared on my phone from an unknown number. "I worked with you both. I know you're innocent. I saw things. Call me." The number belonged to Erica Chang, a junior accountant who'd worked at Morrison and Associates for 3 years. She was young, ambitious, and observant, qualities I'd appreciated when I'd hired her fresh out of graduate school. We met at a park, neutral ground where we could talk without being observed. Erica looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if expecting Marcus to materialize from the shadows. "I could lose my job for talking to you," she said immediately. "Mr. Webb made it clear that anyone who contacts you would be terminated." "Then why are you here?" I asked. She took a breath. Because I watched you build that company. I saw how you treated people, how you cared about doing things right. And I've watched Mr. Webb over the past few months. Something changed in him. He's become controlling, paranoid. Erica told me about incidents I'd missed during my suspension from the company. How Marcus had fired 2 longtime employees who'd questioned his leadership. How he'd changed protocols, restricted access to certain files, insisted on being the sole signatory on major accounts. But there's something else, she said, pulling out her phone. Mr. Webb doesn't know I have access to the executive calendar archive. I was tasked with organizing old files last year. I found something odd. She showed me calendar entries from 18 months ago. Meetings between Marcus and a man named Vincent Torres. Meetings that weren't in the official company records, scheduled during lunch hours and after business hours. Who is Vincent Torres? I asked. That's what I wanted to know. So I looked him up. She swiped to another screen. He's a consultant, supposedly, but his background is questionable. He's been linked to several companies that were investigated for financial fraud, never charged, but always present during the investigations. A consultant who specialized in financial crimes. A man who could teach someone how to embezzle millions and make it look like someone else did it. Erica, would you be willing to testify about this? I asked. She hesitated, fear clear in her eyes. If I testify, my career in this city is over. Everyone will know I went against Mr. Webb. I know, and I can't promise it won't be hard, but I'm asking anyway, because the truth matters. She looked away, toward the playground where children played, oblivious to the adult world of lies and betrayal. I'll think about it, she finally said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And right now, I'd take anything I could get. The trial began on a Monday morning in October, 6 months after that first knock on my office door. The courthouse was a grand building in the downtown district, with marble columns and high ceilings that made every whisper echo. I'd passed it hundreds of times without giving it much thought. Now it represented either my salvation or my destruction. Judge Martin Hayes presided, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for running a tight courtroom. He'd denied several of the prosecution's more aggressive motions during pretrial, which Robert considered a good sign. But he'd also rejected some of our requests, maintaining a careful neutrality that kept both sides on edge. Jury selection had taken 2 days. 12 people who would decide my fate, a mix of ages, backgrounds, and professions. I studied their faces during voir dire, trying to read their thoughts. Who would believe me? Who had already decided I was guilty based on news reports? A retired teacher, a construction foreman, a stay-at-home mother, an IT specialist. Regular people who would now judge whether I'd stolen $2 million and destroyed my own life's work. Victoria Palmer delivered the prosecution's opening statement with practiced precision. She walked the jury through the evidence methodically, the unauthorized transfers, the falsified records, the offshore accounts. She painted me as a man who'd gotten greedy, who'd betrayed not just my partner, but every client who'd trusted us. The defendant would have you believe he was framed, she said, her tone suggesting how absurd she found this claim. That his trusted partner of 20 years suddenly decided to destroy him. But the evidence doesn't support conspiracy theories. It supports facts. And the facts show Daniel Morrison stole $2 million. She was compelling. Even I found myself doubting my own innocence for a moment, and I knew the truth. Then Robert stood for our opening statement. He approached the jury box slowly, making eye contact with each juror. Robert had told me once that trials were won or lost in opening statements. This was where you planted the seed of doubt that would grow throughout the trial. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal, he began, but not the betrayal the prosecution wants you to believe. Daniel Morrison trusted Marcus Webb with everything, his business, his reputation, his future, and Marcus Webb exploited that trust in the most calculated way imaginable. Robert outlined our defense strategy, previewing the forensic evidence, the metadata analysis, the pattern of behavior. He spoke of Vincent Torres, though we couldn't yet prove the connection. He explained how someone with administrator access could frame another person using their credentials. The prosecution will tell you the evidence is overwhelming, Robert said. And they're right. It is overwhelming. Overwhelmingly fabricated. Overwhelmingly designed to point at one man while the real criminal watches from a safe distance. Your job isn't to be convinced by quantity of evidence. It's to examine the quality, the source, the truth beneath the surface. The first week of trial was brutal. The prosecution called witness after witness. FBI forensic accountants who explained the money trail, company employees who testified about my access to systems, clients who'd trusted their money to our firm. Each testimony was a nail hammered into the coffin the prosecution was building around me. I sat at the defense table, forced to watch my reputation dismantled piece by piece. Jennifer attended every day, sitting in the front row of the gallery with Sophie when school permitted. Marcus sat on the opposite side, playing the role of wounded partner with Oscar-worthy performance. During breaks, I'd catch him watching me, not with anger or sadness, but with something almost like curiosity, as if he was conducting an experiment and I was the subject, and he wanted to see how I'd react to each new pressure point. But I didn't break. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. By Friday of the first week, the prosecution rested. Victoria Palmer looked confident as she returned to her table, and I couldn't blame her. On paper, based solely on what the jury had heard so far, I looked guilty as sin. But now it was our turn. Now we would show them the truth. Patricia Hayes was our first witness, and she transformed the courtroom into a classroom. For 3 hours, she walked the jury through forensic accounting principles, explaining how digital transactions left traces, how metadata told stories that numbers alone couldn't convey. She used visual aids, charts and timelines that showed the discrepancies between what the evidence claimed and what the technical data revealed. These transactions attributed to Mr. Morrison show a pattern of access that's physically impossible, Patricia explained, pointing to her timeline. On this date, September 15th, a transfer was supposedly authorized by Mr. Morrison at 2:47 p.m. But security footage, cell phone records, and witness testimony all place him in a client meeting across town at that exact time. Victoria Palmer cross-examined aggressively, trying to poke holes in Patricia's analysis. Couldn't Mr. Morrison have used remote access? A phone? A tablet? Possible, but the device identifier doesn't match any of Mr. Morrison's registered devices. Patricia replied calmly. The identifier matches a laptop registered to Marcus Webb. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hayes gavelled for silence. The prosecution tried to discredit Patricia's findings, suggesting alternative explanations, questioning her methodology. But she held firm, and when she stepped down from the witness stand, I saw something shift in a few jurors' faces. Not certainty yet, but doubt. And doubt was all we needed. Jennifer testified next, and I'd never been more proud of my wife. She explained the technical aspects of how someone could use another person's credentials to commit fraud, how the metadata inconsistencies pointed to deliberate fabrication rather than legitimate transactions. My husband is meticulous about security, Jennifer told the jury. He taught me that. He would never use his credentials carelessly, and he certainly wouldn't leave a trail this obvious if he were actually guilty. Victoria Palmer's cross-examination was pointed. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you have every reason to lie to protect your husband? Your family's entire livelihood depends on his acquittal. Jennifer didn't flinch. My family's entire future depends on the truth. If my husband were guilty, I'd want him held accountable. But he's not, and I won't let an innocent man go to prison because someone else was clever enough to frame him. Then came Diane Webb. Marcus's ex-wife walked into that courtroom like a woman who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. She wore a simple blue dress and no jewelry except a watch. When she was sworn in, her voice was steady. Robert guided her through testimony about Marcus's hidden accounts, his history of financial deception, the elaborate structures he'd built to hide money during their marriage. Did your ex-husband ever mention anything about cryptocurrency investments? Robert asked. Yes, Diane replied. About a year before our divorce, Marcus became obsessed with cryptocurrency. He said it was the future of finance, that traditional banking was obsolete. I thought he was just interested in new technology. Now I understand he was planning how to hide money. Victoria Palmer's objection was immediate. Speculation, Your Honor. The witness cannot know what the defendant's ex-husband was thinking. Sustained, Judge Hayes ruled. The jury will disregard that last statement. But the damage was done. The jury had heard it, and you can't unhear something just because a judge tells you to. The prosecution's cross-examination tried to paint Diane as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge, but she remained composed, matter of fact. She wasn't emotional or vindictive. She was simply telling the truth about a man who'd betrayed her, just as he'd betrayed me. Mrs. Webb, isn't it true that you received a substantial settlement in your divorce? Victoria Palmer asked. Yes, Diane admitted. So Mr. Webb was generous to you, even in divorce? Diane's expression hardened. He paid me to be quiet. There's a difference between generosity and hush money. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Hayes called for order, but the moment had landed. As Diane stepped down, she passed Marcus's seat. For just a second, their eyes met. I saw fear flash across Marcus's face before he masked it with indifference. He was starting to realize that his perfect plan had cracks, and those cracks were spreading. Then came the moment I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Erica Chang had decided to testify. She walked into the courtroom looking terrified but determined, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. When the bailiff swore her in, I heard her voice shake slightly as she said, "I do." Robert approached her gently, understanding that this young woman was risking everything by being here. "Ms. Chang, can you tell the jury how long you worked at Morrison and Associates?" 3 years, Erica replied. "I was hired as a junior accountant right out of grad school. And during that time, did you have opportunity to observe both Mr. Morrison and Mr. Webb?" "Yes, daily. I reported to both of them on different projects." Robert walked her through her observations. The changes in Marcus's behavior over the past year, his increasing control over company systems, his paranoia about employee access to certain files. Then came the crucial testimony. "Ms. Chang, did you discover anything unusual about Mr. Webb's schedule?" Erica nodded. "I was organizing archived files and found calendar entries for meetings between Mr. Webb and a man named Vincent Torres. These meetings weren't in the official company records." Robert introduced evidence, printouts of the calendar entries, documentation of Vincent Torres's background, and his connections to companies investigated for financial fraud. It was circumstantial, but it painted a picture of Marcus seeking expertise in exactly the kind of fraud I'd been accused of. Victoria Palmer's cross-examination was brutal. She went after Erica's loyalty, her motivations, her access to the files she'd found. "Ms. Chang, isn't it true that you're testifying here because you hope Mr. Morrison will rehire you if he's acquitted?" "No," Erica said firmly. "I'm testifying because I believe in the truth, and because I've watched Mr. Webb fire or intimidate anyone who questions him." "You have no concrete proof that these meetings with Mr. Torres were related to any criminal activity, do you?" "No direct proof, no, but then you're speculating?" "I'm reporting what I observed." Victoria Palmer smiled, as if she'd scored a point, but I could see some jurors looked troubled, not convinced that Erica was lying. The next 2 days featured technical witnesses, cybersecurity experts who testified about digital credentials and system access, the FBI agent who'd investigated the case initially, and finally the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marcus Webb took the stand. He looked confident as he was sworn in, every inch the successful businessman wronged by a trusted friend. His suit was immaculate, his expression appropriately solemn. The prosecution's direct examination was a masterclass in sympathetic testimony. Marcus described discovering the fraud, his heartbreak at realizing his partner had betrayed him, his legal obligation to report what he'd found. He spoke about our 20-year friendship, about watching my family suffer, about how difficult this entire process had been. "I keep hoping I'll wake up and this will all be a nightmare," Marcus said, and his voice actually caught with emotion. "Daniel was like a brother to me, but I can't ignore evidence. I can't look the other way when clients have been defrauded." Then Robert stood for cross-examination. He started slow, establishing timeline details, getting Marcus to confirm various facts. Then, so subtly that even I almost missed the shift, Robert began to tighten the noose. "Mr. Webb, you testified that you discovered the fraud in March of this year, correct?" "Yes." "And you immediately reported it to authorities?" "Within 24 hours, yes. Yet these calendar entries show you meeting with Vincent Torres 18 months before that, a man with connections to multiple fraud investigations. Why were you meeting with him?" Marcus's confidence flickered. He was a potential consultant for some international expansion ideas we were considering. "Did Mr. Morrison know about these meetings?" I don't recall if I mentioned them." Robert pulled out more evidence, emails, file access logs, timestamps that contradicted Marcus's testimony about when he'd supposedly discovered the fraud. Each contradiction was small, but they accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. "Mr. Webb, did you create a hidden partition on the company server?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "A partition accessible only with your administrator credentials?" Marcus's lawyer objected, but Judge Hayes allowed the question. "I may have created secure storage for sensitive files. That's not unusual." "Sensitive files like drafts of fraudulent transactions?" The courtroom erupted. Judge Hayes called for order, his gavel echoing through the chaos. Marcus's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed mask finally cracking. Robert pressed forward, relentless now. Mr. Webb, I'm going to read you something found in the metadata of a file on that hidden partition. A note that says, and I quote, "Frame Daniel. Offshore by June. Cayman accounts ready." Do you recognize those words? I've never seen that, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. These words were found in a file created 18 months ago on a partition only you could access. How do you explain that? Marcus's attorney objected repeatedly, but the damage was catastrophic. Robert introduced the forensic evidence that Patricia and Jennifer had uncovered, walking the jury through every technical detail that proved Marcus had the means, motive, and opportunity to frame me. You've testified that you and Mr. Morrison were like brothers, Robert continued. Yet you're asking this jury to believe that your brother of 20 years suddenly decided to destroy everything you'd built together, to steal from clients he'd served faithfully for decades. Isn't the more logical explanation that you orchestrated this fraud and needed someone to blame? That's absurd, Marcus said, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Is it? Let's talk about your finances, Mr. Webb. Your divorce settlement with Diane Webb was substantial. Yet within 6 months you'd purchased a vacation home in the Cayman Islands. Cash purchase. Where did that money come from? The objection came immediately, but Judge Hayes leaned forward. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Webb. I had investments that paid off. Cryptocurrency investments? Robert asked. Investments that started shortly after you began meeting with Vincent Torres, a man known for his expertise in financial fraud? Marcus's attorney called for a recess. Judge Hayes granted it, and I watched Marcus practically flee the witness stand. During the break, I saw him in whispered, heated conversation with his legal team. The confidence he'd entered the courtroom with had evaporated. When court resumed, the prosecution declined to continue direct examination. Marcus stepped down, but the jury's eyes followed him back to his seat. They'd seen behind the mask, and what they'd found wasn't pretty. Closing arguments came the next day. Victoria Palmer did her best to salvage the prosecution's case, reminding the jury of the original evidence, suggesting that our defense was smoke and mirrors designed to confuse rather than illuminate. Don't be distracted by conspiracy theories, she urged. The evidence against Daniel Morrison is real, documented, and overwhelming. Defense attorneys are skilled at creating doubt where none should exist. Then Robert delivered our closing argument, and I'd never heard him speak with such passion. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard testimony about metadata, about digital forensics, about hidden server partitions, technical details that might seem overwhelming. But strip all that away, and this case is simple. 2 men built a company together. One of them got greedy. One of them decided that $2 million was worth more than friendship, more than integrity, more than truth. And when that man stole, he was smart enough to know he needed someone to blame. Robert walked the jury through the timeline one final time, connecting every piece of evidence we'd presented into a coherent narrative of betrayal and deceit. Daniel Morrison made one mistake in this entire story, Robert said. He trusted Marcus Webb. He trusted him with his business, his reputation, his life's work, and Marcus Webb exploited that trust in the most calculated, cold-blooded way imaginable. Don't compound that betrayal by convicting an innocent man. Look at the evidence. Really look at it, and ask yourselves who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to commit this crime. Judge Hayes gave the jury their instructions, and they filed out to deliberate. The waiting began. Hours passed like years. Jennifer and I sat in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, holding hands, barely speaking. Sophie was with Jennifer's mother, spared from this final agony of waiting. Robert checked his phone constantly, though he'd get notified the moment the jury reached a verdict. Try not to read anything into the timing, he said. Quick verdicts can go either way. So can long ones. We waited through lunch, through dinner. The courthouse staff began to talk about sequestering the jury for the night. Then, at 8:47 p.m., Robert's phone buzzed. They have a verdict, he said. My heart stopped. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of my life. We filed back into the courtroom, everyone taking their positions like actors in a play's final scene. The jury entered, their faces carefully neutral. I tried to read them, to find some hint of what they'd decided, but saw nothing. Judge Hayes addressed the jury foreman, a middle-aged man who'd been a high school principal before retirement. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of embezzlement, how do you find? The foreman looked at me. For one terrible second, I saw my entire future hanging in the balance. We find the defendant, Daniel Morrison, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer sobbed beside me, her hand crushing mine. Robert closed his eyes in relief. Somewhere behind us, I heard gasps and murmurs, and at least one person shouting. But I watched the jury. I watched 12 strangers who'd looked at me with suspicion for weeks now. Look at me with something different. Understanding. Belief. Some even nodded slightly, as if to say, "We saw the truth." Judge Hayes gavelled for order, but he was smiling. "Mr. Morrison, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." I stood on shaking legs, turning to embrace Jennifer, to hug Robert, to thank Patricia and everyone who'd believed in me when the world had decided I was guilty. And then I looked across the courtroom at Marcus. He sat frozen, his face ashen, as federal agents approached his table. They'd been waiting for the verdict, and now they had what they needed. I watched them place handcuffs on the man who'd tried to destroy me, read him his rights, lead him away. Our eyes met one last time. I didn't see remorse there, or shame, just shock that his perfect plan had failed. The real criminal was finally being treated like one. 6 months after the verdict, I stood in the rebuilt office of Morrison and Associates, though it wasn't called that anymore. We'd renamed it Morrison Hayes Accounting, adding Patricia to the partnership. The firm that Marcus had tried to destroy was stronger than ever, built on a foundation of trust that had been tested and proven true. The investigation into Marcus revealed depths of deception I'd never imagined. The $2 million was just the beginning. Over 5 years, he'd stolen nearly $8 million, routing it through cryptocurrency accounts and offshore holdings. Vincent Torres, the consultant, was arrested as an accomplice. Both men were now serving federal prison sentences. Diane Webb stopped by the office occasionally, becoming an unexpected friend. She'd found peace in finally being believed, in seeing justice served. "Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing you're right when everyone tells you you're wrong," she told me once. "Thank you for not giving up." Erica Chang became one of our senior accountants, her courage rewarded with opportunity. The employees who'd stuck with the company during the dark days received bonuses and promotions. Those who'd abandoned ship weren't welcomed back. Sophie returned to school, slowly rebuilding friendships. Children are resilient, but she carried scars from watching her father accused, from learning too young that people you trust can hurt you. Jennifer and I made sure she also learned the other lesson, that truth matters, that fighting for it is worth the cost. The local news that had crucified me ran stories about the verdict, about Marcus's arrest, about how wrong they'd been. Some apologized, others moved on to the next scandal. That's the nature of public memory, short and fickle. But I learned lessons from this nightmare that I needed to share. Standing in my office, looking out at the team working below, I thought about what I'd want to tell someone facing their own battle against lies and betrayal. But perhaps the most important lesson, betrayal reveals character, both the betrayer's and your own. Marcus's betrayal showed what he was capable of when tested by greed. But it also showed me what I was capable of when tested by injustice. I could have become bitter, vengeful, destroyed by the experience. Instead, I chose to fight with truth as my weapon and emerge stronger. The scar remains. I'm more cautious now, less naive about human nature. But I refuse to let Marcus's betrayal make me cynical. Most people are good. Most partnerships are genuine. Most trust is warranted. You just have to be wise enough to recognize the exceptions. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. A new day, a new project, a new chapter. The nightmare was over, but life continued. And that, ultimately, was the greatest victory. Not just proving my innocence, but reclaiming my life, my purpose, my future. The jury had realized who the real criminal was, but more importantly, I'd realized who I really was. Someone who doesn't break under pressure, who fights for truth, who survives betrayal, and comes out stronger. That's a lesson no trial can teach. It's learned only by living through fire and choosing not to let it burn you to ash. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand alone for truth when the world doubted you, drop your city in the comments below. Let's build a community of people who understand that justice isn't always swift, but it's always worth fighting for. Your story matters. Your truth matters.